We're jumping on this Real Crime Profile, jumping on emergency update because there's so much breaking news about the serial killer who's been apprehended after a very long time
From
um,
Gilgo Beach.
in Gilgo Beach in Long Island. But we wanted to jump on with Jim because not for today's news, but in 2011, Jim, you were interviewed. Can you just tell us real quickly about that? And
Yeah,
um,
I think it was New York Times that interviewed me, and I did a profile of the offender based on the information that we had at the time. And a few things jumped out. One is that there was a seasonal nature to his offending, and I thought because the crimes were so sophisticated, he was able to hide them for so long. There was a high intelligence level, and I thought that and I knew there was a connection to that location. He just didn't just stumble on that location. He must have had a strong connection to that location. And so for those reasons, I thought it was a white male who was in his late 30s to early 40s and had a certain level of education and sophistication and was criminally sophisticated as well as forensically sophisticated. But we didn't know at the time that one, the burlap sacks were camouflage burlap, and two, that there were hairs found on the bodies or in the burlap sack or in the tape. And so all those things have come together. But the fact is that he had called the surviving family members of one or more of the victims, and that taunting told me that he was a sexual sadist. So when they found torture porn in his computer, it matched up absolutely. And then they found out that the crimes he committed were at the very same time his wife and kids were away on vacation, which is exactly what I had said, because it felt like that seasonal nature meant there was a certain part of the year that he could not commit his crimes. But I know he's got a rich fantasy life. He definitely equates violence with sex. He gets off on causing and witnessing the pain of others. He's a sexual sadist. And more than that, I believe that he is a control freak, and that the architecture as his profession lives that out. I mean, they're very meticulous, they're very exacting, and I think that he must, in his home life, his work life, and his crimes, have that personality aspect play out.
That level of control, coercive control.
Yes.
And I have to say, I've not seen a serial killer case yet where there isn't that element when they're married and in those relationships. People always think about the physical stuff that's happening, but we should really think about the controlling nature of these individuals and how they coercively control people around them. So that meticulous nature you talk about, Jim, you see that in the planning. Everything that you said in your profile, which I read in the New York Times, was just spot on, even down to him leaving at certain periods. And I think the thing that always shocks people, or I should say his wife leaving at certain periods and then him committing the offenses, what shocks people, and we always hear neighbors coming out and saying things like, oh, well, it's such a surprise, it's such a shock to us. But what those neighbors were also saying was that they didn't know him or the family at all.
Right, there you go. And it just really hangs a lantern on the fact that people are incredibly complicated and you can't really put them in a pigeonhole. And also, people will show different masks and different facets of their personality to different people in different settings. And so don't be surprised that he's not acting the very blatant sexual sadist when he's at work, because he's trying to make money. But when you look at the condition of his house, apparently it was dilapidated, and I would say that's more a symptom of how he treated his family, that it wasn't a priority for him, that he kept that sort of the thing you say a lot of times when these guys are arrested, the poor me syndrome, right? That he probably had that as his quote cover to his wife and kids. He tried to make it look like everything was just sort of not going well or whatever, but apparently he had a good job and he could have lived in a much better setting, but he wanted to be at that location, maybe because that's how he ties into these crimes. That's how, he has access to the dumping zone. That's where he may have gotten them to come there, or at least to a place that he could reach from there very quickly.
Jim, when you were interviewed in 2011, how many victims were they asking you about?
Well, they had, at that time, there had been, I think, nine bodies that had been recovered. I think there are more now. Well, I know there's one male and a toddler that were also recovered. I'm not sure if those are connected. I don't have the forensics of all of them, but I know they've charged him with three, and I think there's a fourth one that's pending. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are more of those bodies that get charged to him, but also I wouldn't be surprised if there are more precursor crimes that he committed, and hopefully they'll be able to find those, because I would expect peeping Tom, I would expect breaking and entering, I would expect stalking and that kind of behavior from him before he even started killing. So I think he probably started killing, in his 30s, and it was in his 40s when the bodies were began to be discovered, right? Or were I think he was 46 when the last woman went missing, but I'm not positive about that timeline.
We'll do a deeper dive on this,
Okay.
obviously. Laura,
Yeah,
did
sure.
anything
Yeah, I
else?
mean, I think we're here from women who have had creepy encounters with him where he's put them on edge or he's made them feel very uncomfortable. I mean, let's not forget this guy really stands out, right? He's 6'4" to 6'6". I mean, he's a big guy. He was called, one of the witnesses who saw him in the Amber Costello case called him an ogre. I mean, you see him next to law enforcement. He's a big guy.
Right.
He stands out. But I also just think with the marriage, I just want to go back to that because, see, people always say, oh, she must have known something. Not always. And some of these individuals, these psychopaths, marry women to have the cloak of credibility, to look like the family guy and to have children, and they use them as an extension to insulate themselves, to keep them safe from other people questioning. So the fact that neighbors didn't know them, that tells me that they were isolated.
Right.
Did he isolate his wife and children? Yes, she went off at various times on trips to Maryland and Iceland and so forth. But people always want to know what she has to say, and I would be interested to know too, but not to blame her.
No.
There would normally be a high level of control. Do you remember with Jerry Brudos, where his wife wasn't allowed in certain areas of the house and he controlled her in terms of how she even vacuumed and her wearing stilettos? We see a lot of these cases, and I have in my work, where psychopaths are married and they do have children, and the quality of those relationships are very controlling, and these men are very dangerous, and that cloak of credibility is a real problem.
Yeah, sexual sadist serial killers are the most dangerous type of serial killers. But another aspect to him is that apparently a lot of his pornography had to do with children. And remember, his victims, he chose sex workers who were petite, so he could play that into the fantasy of doing this to children. He probably didn't have access to children as easily as he had access to these women. And so this is probably a guy who was sexually diverse. He was capable of having sexual relationships and arousal with age appropriate adults, but also arousal with children. So his fantasies were, I'm sure, filled with violent sexual acts towards children.
Oh, when you see the bail application, I mean, I read the 32 pages and you see what he was searching on. I mean, it is really deviant, sadistic, children and women. And of course, he was searching on the investigation.
Right.
And how law enforcement didn't catch the Long Island serial killer through the phone calls. So there's very clear evidence in terms of all his search history and these other names that he had and mobile phone numbers and emails. I mean, this is an extensive investigation over a period of time, right? And it's very thorough. Having seen that bail application, and they talk to his criminal sophistication, which Jim and I, you and I both know, these individuals learn this stuff over time. Yeah,
right.
he was
And
also searching
experience,
on
right?
and experience. He was searching about other serial killers, and he was learning his trade craft all the while under this guise of being this family man and this architect. But he knew what he was doing. And I think that that part, it looks like the investigators, certainly in this last year, have done a very extensive and thorough investigation.
Right.
Albeit my question is, why did it take so long to form this task force of, great investigators and analysts who came together? I mean, really, given that this was happening, we go back to 2010, when bodies were showing up, women were showing up. And it just seems that when women were showing up dead, there wasn't really a rigorous investigation, even
Right.
though these were linked cases. And that really
Right.
bothers me that it took such a long time to put this team together.
Yeah, having grown up in the area, nearby, I know that there's a lot of politics in Long Island, and apparently, they got a new police chief or commissioner who had been NYPD. And although the Long Island police departments sometimes have been very isolated, they only work alone. This new chief brought in the NYPD, the sheriff's department, and the FBI, and they all worked together. And in a shorter period of time, they were able to not only resolve the case and find out who the killer was, but also build a very good case, a very good circumstantial case. But I think they're going to have more information as time goes on, as tests come back, as searches, as more in-depth searches of his computer and his home and any other place that he might have, like a storage unit or some other place where he committed his crimes. Those searches are going to bring back more direct evidence against him.
Well, let me just be clear that it took them 2 months to link his car and him being the identified individual with the Chevrolet Avalanche car that was seen in the Amber Costello case. So once that task force of these skilled investigators and analysts came together, it took them just 2 months to identify him. I think, A, that's amazing, but B, that shows you that if these great minds have been brought together earlier on, and the politics, for me, Jim, how I feel about this, it has no place when we're talking about, dead women or dead men and body parts and bodies turning up, and then these politics and these egos and everything gets in the way. It just shows, and it looks to me like a very good job when you read that 32 page, but it just shows what people are capable of if there's a resource and a priority put to it. And I have to say, given that these were prostitutes, I'm sure that played in. We've seen, that happen many, many times. That shouldn't be the reason why cases like this aren't resourced. He was a very dangerous individual, and I'm sure we're going to hear about many more victims, sadly.
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned his name yet. I don't know if we will, but we should probably say that this offender this suspect is being charged with the slayings of Melissa Barthelemy, 24, Megan Waterman, 22, and as Laura mentioned, Amber Lynn Costello, who was 27. And it looks like they're also investigating the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25. And as you say, there could be many, many more.
And Shanann Gilbert, which of course was the case that they were searching when she disappeared in May 2010. That's who they were looking for. And then they stumble upon the body of Melissa. And then a couple of days later, 3 other additional sets of human remains. And that's what I mean. The stumbling upon human remains in this way, but they're not resourcing. Any layperson would think, wow, red flag, these bodies being found in the same place, women being bound in a similar way, right? Even if you don't have
material, right?
With a similar material. I mean, all of these things point to the same perpetrator, and therefore you would think this needs to be resourced, because who is he and who else is he harming? So I'm really pleased that an arrest has been made, and this came, it's come very late in the day, and of course people are very pleased about that. But I am thinking about the victims and their families, and of course his family too. I am thinking about his wife and his children, because the impact on them, well, he's changed the course of their lives forever. And the selfish and entitled, dangerous individuals, who just are self-serving and are about their own needs, this need-driven behavior, which Jim knows all about. It has such serious repercussions on so many people. The ripples on the pond of the families, and the legacy of this is just horrendous.
Yeah, and they have to live the rest of their lives connected to him.
Absolutely. But
So
yeah,
what,
good job, Jim. When I saw the New York Times article, I ferociously read through it all. And then I saw my friend and colleague, the mention there and the picture. And, you were very specific in what you said. And people poo-poo what we do. But the bottom line is we are experienced professionals, and we understand this type of behavior, the sadistic behavior, the stalking aspect of it, the fact that this is somebody who was criminally sophisticated. So who else was he harming? And even the timing, and as you know, Jim, the timeline is so key. And that timeline of the bodies being found, the women disappearing, and now mapping across his timeline, it's extensive, detailed, time-consuming work.
right.
But you did a great job, and congratulations, because it is
I was taught well.
important.
I was taught well. So one more question. What do you think about his reaction in court? His lawyer said he was crying, he was sobbing that he wasn't
Oh,
the
boo
one.
hoo. Oh, I feel
I
terrible
know.
for him. Boo
Crying
fucking.
because he was caught. I mean,
Exactly.
we all know
Exactly.
why he's crying, or we
Yeah.
do, but yes, you can see that reaction at times. But the poor me syndrome is going to kick in massively. But the
Yep.
bottom line is the evidence is incredibly strong.
Yes.
And it's multiple lines of evidence, from DNA to the burner phones to the multiple cell phones and email accounts and Tinder
His vehicle,
profiles.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And cell towers, vehicles. There's just an eyewitness testimony, and
It's
the
only
way
going
that
to
he
get
looks.
stronger. Right.
Yeah. So I feel that they are very confident in terms of what they've released, the detail of which, and the fact he, managed to avoid apprehension for so long. No wonder they didn't want him bailed, right? This is somebody who was criminally sophisticated and knew exactly what he was doing.
Right. He wasn't as forensically sophisticated as he thought he was. I think he did take measures to try to clean the bodies, but he couldn't help secondary and tertiary transfer of trace evidence. And that's one of the big ways that he was actually caught. So it's kind of apropos too that it was his wife's hairs that ended up confirming that he was the one. And she was out of town during those times, and yet so we know she was not involved, but she helped bring him down, which is awesome.
Yeah, I also find that interesting, that component, that it's more of her hairs than his. So I just wonder whether it's her belts or he's using things of hers, because that transfer is very intriguing. The very fact she was out of the country or out of the state at the time, well, thank goodness for that, because they may be looking
At her, right?
at her, right? So I wonder whether that was intentional on his behalf. I mean, time will tell. Maybe we won't know, but it's certainly a horrific case that lots of people have talked about. There's been lots of documentaries made. And, really it just showed that the devil was in the detail. He was hiding in plain sight the whole time, as we always say. And it does get my goat when these individuals, are married with children, and they use that as a way to
Cover.
try and insulate themselves. And people really need to wake up to the fact that just because they've got children, or there's car seats in the car, or they're married, that doesn't make them any less dangerous. In fact, my research at New Scotland Yard showed that 1 in 8 who raped their partners and ex-partners were raping other women outside the home too, strangers. They're very dangerous individuals. And that's why with psychopathy, Dr. Robert Hare found in 1993 that 25% of domestic violence offenders were psychopaths. That was in 1993. That's not including coercive control. And my research shows that every serial killer case I've been involved with, when they've had intimate relationships, they've been coercively controlling and abusive. So it's a risk factor to look out for.
Absolutely. So thank you everybody for listening. This is a case we're going to keep on top of. This is incredibly important because we don't want this to happen again. People have to be very aware of their circumstances. It's unfortunate when offenders prey on people who are in a vulnerable position. And certainly that's what this guy did.
And also the lessons for law enforcement, of which there are many. So I really hope that those lessons are stripped out of this case and they are truly operationalized, because the same lessons just seem to keep repeating. But thank goodness he's been arrested. That's good news.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jim and Laura, for jumping on. This is a down and dirty, recording. We're all in the middle of our day, but we wanted to jump on and give people insight into what, Jim's article from 2011. You can still look at that in the New York Times archives if you want to go and jump on that. And we'll be following this case. And thank you, Laura. I know today's a busy day for you. It's a birthday.
It's a very busy day, a big birthday for Mr. Umberto Gonzalez. So I've got to run off and get the balloons sorted and everything else. So
all right.
All right,
Wish him a happy birthday and give our best to Rafi. All right. Take care.
For now, this is Real Crime Profile signing out.